Right. So thank you very much, Kathleen, for inviting me, and thank you very much for that very wholesome introduction. I'm not sure how much of it I deserve. And I'd say good evening to everybody who's turned up, and even a couple of good afternoons, because I think there are people here from Canada, and I think it's just gone 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Right. Okay. So I'm going to try not to go over my time. I've written down here it's 7:10, and I'm going to try and stop as close to 7:30 as I possibly can. Right, so I'm going to start off with a poem called A Wet Break. It's like a lot of poems, it goes back to a specific memory. This one goes back to something that used to happen in primary school. But beyond that particular memory, it's a poem about the business of remembering and how we remember, and in particular the way that when you get to a certain age, and looking around here, I think most people here will appreciate this, time seems to speed up. The longer you're alive, the quicker the time seems to go. So this is A Wet Break. Outside in the street, where skies have opened, a dingy curtain flaps across the day. As rain beats down with blank persistence on shining roofs of cars, dissolves my window panes, bringing back to mind for no apparent purpose, a wet break at primary school. How in partitioned rooms with raggedy copies of Beano or Dandy, we were fractious backstreet kids with time enough to spare. And if an hour seems stuck forever in a non-event of walls and rain, years have since spun free, cruising blurred distances, adjusted to the focus of each idle glance. Right, now the next couple of poems are going to take us to Ireland. I was born in England, but both my parents come from Ireland. And when we were kids, we used to spend all our summer holidays in the west of Ireland. And the first poem I'm going to read is called The Dresser. This poem actually started off as a half-baked attempt to translate a poem. I wanted to translate a poem by Rimbaud called Le Buffet, which is about a sideboard. And I very quickly got bored of this. And then I suddenly remembered my grandparents' dresser in their central room of their little cottage in the west of Ireland. And then I decided to stop wasting my time with somebody else's bit of furniture, but to write a poem about a bit of furniture that I actually had some kind of real connection with. So this is basically about the bit of furniture, but it's also about the way that there was a lot of migration from the west of Ireland, obviously my own parents and many of their siblings. So this poem is called The Dresser. The shrine and archive of those who had gone, the dresser loomed imposingly, hogging its space. Their one attempt at opulence in a room that was otherwise Spartan. Ranged above it, in a gap left beneath the ceiling, there were portraits of couples who had tied the knot elsewhere. Brides and grooms in cheap suits they'd wear again on Sundays. Pushed to the back of a shelf, half hidden behind unsorted papers and the pots for pins and pens, a girl in a white dress, her image silver framed, clutched her missal in a gloved hand, staring back awkwardly through jumble. A repository for anything too highfalutin for everyday use, it housed the china they laid out for guests, the loaded Yanks who were distant cousins, trying to find their roots, or English kids whose accents wavered between two places, their mums and dads who were sons and daughters. Stashed away alongside the cutlery, the lace, and a stiff folded tablecloth, there were biscuit tins that bulged with photos, in which the poses always seemed the same. The next poem is called Cows. And this is a really old poem. This poem, I wrote this poem, God, I must have written it more than 40 years ago. I was about 19 or 20 when I wrote this one. So it's one of the earliest poems I wrote. And it's a poem in which I try to get the excitement we felt as kids when we used to cross Ireland from Dublin to the west in a train. And there's all the anticipation of getting out into the countryside. And cows seem to be very emblematic of that country experience, because there weren't very many cows to be seen or to be dealt with in my hometown in England. But once you got out into the fields in Ireland, they were full of cows. So this is Cows. From compartment windows, they were fake, too far away to be real. Frisians, Shorthorns, Angus, painted cows in a book of fields. While on the train, I rampaged, shuttling impatience through pages and pages of green. Unexpectedly, we'd arrive and land in a world where they moped. The first day up, a drover, I'd goad them on with a stick, then savor their warmth at milking when packed into pungent stalls, where a white jet steamed, frothed up in a galvanized pail. The fields outside were full of their muck, in pats that were ringed and perfect. Wherever I ran, that muck would cling to my shoes. Right, we're all living through a very strange time, and part of the strangeness for me is the fact that my lovely mum died shortly after the start of lockdown. It had absolutely nothing to do with COVID. And it wasn't really expected, because she's always been hale and hearty. But anyway, there you go. And it suddenly occurred to me the other day also, 2021, my father died in 1981. So that's 40 years since my dad died. He died very, very young. He died at the age of 55 following an accident on a building site. So I thought I would move on to a couple of poems which I wrote about my parents. The first one, which I wrote for my dad, I wrote as in his memory, because he had died many, many years ago. The one I'm going to read, I will read shortly, about my mother. I didn't write it in memory of at all, because she was very much alive and kicking at the time. Anyway, I'll start off with one about my dad. This is called shadow boxing. Like a lot of men of his generation, a lot of Irish men anyway, he was quite a big fan of boxing, to the extent that he dragged me into boxing. And I had a fairly brief and completely undistinguished boxing career between the ages of about 8 and 11. And by the time I was ready to go to secondary school, I'd kind of had enough of it and packed it in. So anyway, this is shadow boxing. The closest my dad ever got to poetry was when he savored some word like pugilist, or the tiptoe springiness he sensed in bob and weave. His unalloyed delight in the flightings and eyeball to eyeball hype that went with big fight weigh-ins. And maybe I should have been a contender when I did my stint in the ring. My dad convinced I had style and the stamp of a winner. In the end, I just got bored. You had to have a killer's instinct to do much better than a draw. In the gym, the lights are low. It's after hours, I'm on my own. The boards are rank with sweat and stale endeavor. Shadow boxing like the best of them. I will show him feints, a classic stance, trying always to keep up my guard. And this is one I wrote for my mother. 140. I've sort of gone with the logic of the poems, which mean I'm swapping between three books. So sorry if I'm flapping about a bit. Right, this poem is called Lives of the Saints. I've written quite a lot of poems over the years about my Catholic upbringing and my lapsed Catholicism. This one, I get the kind of Catholic influence into this poem about my mother. My mum was a great reader, and she was a member of Foyle's book club, if any of you are old enough to remember that. And she had this anomalous set of books in her library, a 5-volume set called The Lives of the Saints by a man called Butler, Father Butler. And it was, you know, tales of martyrdom and great virtue and all that kind of stuff. So at a certain point, when I thought I was beyond kids' books, I started looking at my mum's library to see what she had on offer. And this is a poem I wrote about it many, many years later. How am I going? Oh, right, I better get a move on, I think. Right, this is called Lives of the Saints. God alone knows why our mum had bought them. A set of 5 thumping tomes with green boards and gilt titles. The cross embossed on each was emblematic of a better place, while she seemed happy enough with this one. In her small bookcase, they were dusty slabs, laid flat on the bottom shelf. Never read or even opened on a rainy day, they were crowded out by flimsier stuff. Time and the hour, these lovers fled away. So when I was after a grown-up book, this is where I started. The Dark Secret of Josephine, Cousin Kate, Venetia. Their covers mainly soppy, carriages and bonnets, too much flirting spoiled the plots. No lovers' games distracted Butler's saints, who knelt down and prayed serenely on rank and clotted sand, or otherwise bided their time, single-mindedly focused on healing afflictions, saying their prayers. Fulgentius, shining one, Chrysostom, the golden-mouthed, were not the names of souls who yielded, accepting the final cut. Eulalia's neck was like a fountain, from which, unabashed, a white dove fluttered. Right, so maybe, yes, I'll skip one here because I think I'm going to be struggling otherwise. Right, the next poem, but people have been writing lots and lots of poems about the pandemic. And if somebody asked me to write a poem about the pandemic, I wouldn't know where to start, because I never know where to start if someone says, why don't you write a poem about something? And then it suddenly occurred to me that I've got a poem which is kind of appropriate. It's a poem based on that famous Van Gogh painting of the artist's bedroom. And it's a very bleak little room. basically 3 walls and a window. And the poem is kind of about going into and possibly coming out of depression. And of course, it's all about being in an enclosed space. So this is the artist's bedroom. Any room you like can be a refuge, with 3 closed walls and a window through which you glimpse the world. One by one, the walls collapse, extending your view towards both east and west, but then revealing everything you thought you'd left behind. The low ceiling lifts into a sky so distant, you forget sometimes it's there. All that remains is a window that you will slowly fill with bridges, boats, faces, trees, some yellow, white, or purple flowers, the endless waves of a cornfield above which a handful of wind-tossed birds seem to be holding their own. Right, try and raise the mood a little bit after that one. Right, I think I'm going to just about manage to sneak 2 more in. God, 20 minutes can go quite quickly. Well, it's gone quite quickly for me. I hope it's gone quickly for you. Right, this next one is about a car. 170. It's a poem I wrote about me and my wife. My wife's background is remarkably similar to mine, and she swore when she went on a year abroad to France as a teacher, as I did, which is how come we met. She swore she would never marry an Irishman or anyone in any way like her father. So what she was after was some glamorous Frenchman. But anyway, she met up with me. So I lived in a village, she lived in the town. We needed some form of transport or else we'd have never got anywhere. So we bought this death trap of a car, a 2CV. So this is called the 2CV. The first car we owned was a 2CV with no certifiable history. The year we got together, we drove it to the end of its days. With its tinny, dinted roof, it had an air of slumped defeat. We rose above quite easily. When summer broke all records, the windows that didn't quite close were an unexpected bonus. Its mind-boggling gear stick seemed set to leave its socket. The functional dashboard as neat as an early Avro's. Our one encounter with the law, a strapped and booted gendarme, required a shameless display of fawning franglais, a set of bulbs and a red triangle raised its status to legal. On days off, our alpine ascents were a puttering epic. Each free-falling return, a foot to the floor, held note of whinging metal. It was sheer foolhardiness, I hear you say, to make such journeys in such a bagnole. And I, of course, can see you are right. As always, I can only agree. Right, I'll finish off with a poem called Man on a Wire. This is from my current collection, Staring at a Hoopoe. And I had a whole batch of poems that hadn't gone into other collections. And I thought, what am I going to do with this? This is a random selection of poems. And then it suddenly dawned upon me that they weren't a random selection of poems. Well, I suppose the thing is they all came from inside my head, and we have our own obsessions. And they all got into shape when I came across a brilliant quote from the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, who said, "Life is understood backwards, but has to be lived forwards." It's kind of a classic existential kind of way of looking at life. You just make it up as you go along, and it's only when you can reflect on what's happened that you can give it any sense. Anyway, this poem that I'm going to read seemed to typify that, and it's a poem about a Frenchman who in the 1980s slung a high wire between the Twin Towers in Manhattan. This was in the 80s, before 9/11, when obviously they got destroyed. And then he proceeded to do an illegal high wire walk across these wires. And when I read this at a poetry group that I used to attend, one of the people in the group said, "Do you realize that whole poem is one sentence?" And I hadn't had a clue that it was, but I was quite pleased when he pointed this out, because I suppose the poem is kind of taking one step, one step, one step until he finally gets to the other side. And I haven't entirely followed the facts of this poem. My ending, the ending of this poem, is what I think should have happened, but unfortunately, in the world we live in, things don't happen the way they should do. But all's well in my poem. So this is Man on a Wire. When he looks back on his life, he will see that the best of it was a journey he took from A to B on a wire between two buildings. His every breath a distillation of what it meant to keep your nerve and hold steady. Each muscle braced and quivering like the wire itself, which at a distance was no more than a filament, but close up was a hawser, along which he took illicit steps, knowing his future weighed upon them. And all things were simple once the choice was made. However the pole teetered, or the air roared wildly above a world of chairs and carpets, dates and deliveries, or the cops who stared amazed at a man walking across the sky, whom later they cuffed and cautioned apologetically, before asking him politely his name and a few relevant details. Thank you very much.